Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Okay, so you're saying you're interested in post-World War II Europe.
Yes.
We're not just talking about, rebuilding cities here.
Right.
We're diving into the ideological battleground that Europe became after the war.
Yeah.
Specifically, how the rise of communism in Italy and France, completely shattered that wartime alliance.
Yeah.
And set the stage for the Cold War.
Yeah. It's a fascinating period because it really flips the script on how we typically view World War II. We tend to think of it as this moment of, unity.
Right.
The Allied powers coming together to defeat this, common enemy.
Right.
But the reality is that the seeds of distrust and division were already there simmering beneath the surface.
Right, because it wasn't just, bricks and buildings that needed rebuilding.
Right.
It was entire systems of government, economy,
Exactly.
ideologies, and into that vacuum steps communism, which had actually gained a lot of traction during the war.
Yeah, especially in Italy and France. And these countries, you got to remember, they had experienced fascist regimes.
Right.
The communist parties, the PCI in Italy, the PCF in France.
Yeah.
They were actively involved in the resistance movements against those regimes. So they were seen as heroes fighting for liberation,
Right.
which gave them a certain moral authority in the post-war era.
So while the rest of Europe is sort of picking up the pieces,
Right.
these communist parties are already organized, mobilized,
Absolutely.
offering a compelling alternative to the chaos and uncertainty of the time.
Precisely. And their message resonated with a lot of people, particularly the working class who had borne the brunt of the war's devastation.
Right.
They promised economic equality, social justice, workers' rights, things that appealed to people who were desperate for change and a better future.
And this is where the U.S. starts to get a little nervous, right?
Right.
They poured resources into defeating fascism.
Yeah.
And now this new threat emerges right on the doorstep of their allies.
Absolutely. From the U.S. perspective, they saw the growing popularity of communism in Italy and France as a sign of Soviet expansionism.
Right.
There was this fear fueled by what some historians call the Orthodox view, that Stalin was pulling the strings, aiming to turn Western Europe into a collection of Soviet satellite states.
So how do we go from this fear of Soviet expansion to something like the Marshall Plan?
Yeah.
It seems like a big leap from communism is gaining popularity to let's pour billions of dollars into rebuilding Europe.
It's a critical turning point.
Right.
And to understand it, we need to look at the work of George Kennan and his famous long telegram.
Okay.
Kennan was an American diplomat. And his analysis of Soviet intentions basically shaped U.S. foreign policy for decades. He argued that the Soviets were inherently expansionist, driven by insecurity and ideology.
Right.
The only way to counter them, he believed, was to contain their influence. To prevent the spread of communism beyond its existing borders.
Containment. There's a term you hear a lot in Cold War history.
Right.
But it wasn't just about military force, right?
No. Kennan argued for a more multifaceted approach. One that included economic aid, political support for democratic governments, and a firm but patient stance against Soviet aggression. And that's where the Marshall Plan comes in.
So walk us through that.
Yeah.
What exactly was the Marshall Plan?
Okay.
And how did it aim to combat the spread of communism?
Well, launched in 1947, the Marshall Plan, officially known as the European Recovery Program, was a massive economic aid package offered to war-torn European nations. It provided billions of dollars in aid to rebuild infrastructure, jumpstart industries, and essentially get these countries back on their feet economically.
Sounds like a pretty generous offer, right?
Yeah.
Help your allies rebuild and prevent the spread of communism. Win-win situation?
On the surface, yes. But of course, it was much more complicated than that. Remember, we're talking about different historical interpretations here. While the Marshall Plan did provide crucial aid, it also served U.S. strategic interests.
So unpack that for us.
Yeah.
What were those strategic interests, and how do they challenge this idea of the U.S. as a purely benevolent actor?
Well, for one, the Marshall Plan helped to create new markets for American goods. A rebuilt Europe, after all, would need resources products.
Right.
And the U.S. was in a prime position to provide them. It also strengthened U.S. influence in the region by tying European economies closer to the U.S.
Right.
The Marshall Plan essentially created a bloc of nations with shared interests and a dependence on American support.
So it was a way of countering Soviet influence,
Yeah.
not just ideologically, but economically and politically as well.
Absolutely.
But how did Stalin react to all of this?
Yeah.
I can't imagine he was thrilled about the U.S. essentially setting up shop in what he saw as his backyard.
You're right, he wasn't.
Okay.
Stalin saw the Marshall Plan as a blatant attempt by the U.S. to expand its influence and undermine Soviet interests in Europe. He responded by tightening his grip on Eastern Europe, establishing the Eastern Bloc,
Right.
and creating his own version of the Marshall Plan called Comecon,
Well, okay.
the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance.
So we're seeing the beginnings of what will become a decades-long standoff between East and West,
Yeah.
all stemming from these initial anxieties about communism in Italy and France.
Right.
But it's important to remember this isn't just some geopolitical chess match.
Right.
There were real people caught in the middle of all of this.
Absolutely. We can't lose sight of the human dimension of this history.
Right.
Ordinary Italians and French citizens were grappling with the aftermath of war, trying to rebuild their lives.
Right.
And they were drawn to the promises of communism, social justice, economic equality, a fairer society. It's crucial to understand why these ideas resonated so deeply,
Yeah.
particularly for those who felt failed by the existing systems.
It's easy to fall into this trap of viewing history as black and white.
Yeah,
Good guys versus bad guys. But it's always far more complicated than that.
it always is.
Right.
And that's why it's important to engage with different historical perspectives.
Right.
For example, there's the revisionist school of thought.
Okay.
They argue that the U.S. wasn't just this innocent defender of freedom.
Okay.
They were actively intervening in other countries' affairs, sometimes covertly, to secure their own interests and prevent the emergence of governments they didn't like, even if those governments were democratically elected.
So the revisionists would say the U.S. was playing power politics just as much as the Soviets,
Right.
just with different branding.
In a way, yes. They would point to instances like the 1948 Italian elections,
Right.
where the U.S. was accused of funneling money and resources to defeat the PCI, fearing a communist victory. The revisionists argue that these actions contradict the U.S.'s stated goal of promoting democracy and highlight a more cynical pursuit of power and influence.
It's a messy picture for sure.
Yeah.
We've got the Orthodox view, the revisionist take,
Right.
and even the realist perspective, which emphasizes the role of power and national interest in shaping international relations.
Yeah.
How do we reconcile these different interpretations?
It's not about picking sides or declaring one interpretation as the correct one. It's about understanding the complexities, acknowledging the biases inherent in each perspective,
Right.
and recognizing that history is rarely black and white.
So taking all of this into account, did the U.S. containment strategy actually work?
Yeah.
Did the Marshall Plan achieve its goals?
The Marshall Plan undoubtedly played a significant role in stabilizing Western European economies and preventing the immediate spread of communism in the region.
Okay.
But it's also important to remember that success is a relative term.
Meaning?
Well, the Marshall Plan also exacerbated divisions between East and West, solidifying the Iron Curtain and fueling an arms race that would define the Cold War for decades. It created a climate of suspicion and mistrust that had far-reaching consequences.
It's fascinating how a policy designed to contain communism could also end up intensifying global tensions and setting the stage for a different kind of conflict.
Right.
But what about the communist parties in Italy and France?
Yeah.
Did they simply fade away in the face of U.S. intervention and economic recovery?
Not at all. While they didn't come to power in those immediate post-war years, they remained influential forces in their respective countries.
Right.
The PCI in particular continued to enjoy widespread support, advocating for workers' rights, social reforms, and challenging U.S. influence in Europe.
So the fear of communism might have abated somewhat,
Yeah,
but the ideas, the movement itself, continued to resonate.
absolutely. And that's a crucial point.
Yeah.
We often focus on the geopolitical maneuvering of the Cold War,
Right.
but it's essential to remember that these were real ideologies competing for hearts and minds, shaping domestic politics and influencing global events for decades to come.
Right. It's interesting how we tend to study history in the, these neat little boxes
Right.
with clear beginnings and endings.
Yeah.
But as you've pointed out, like the ripple effects of these events are still being felt today.
Exactly. We're still grappling with the legacies of the Cold War,
Right.
the divisions it created, and the ways in which it shaped our understanding of global power dynamics.
It makes you wonder, like, what events happening right now will be seen as turning points decades from now?
Right.
What will future historians look back on and say, that's where it all changed?
It's a question worth pondering. What might seem like small events today
Right.
could have far-reaching consequences down the line. It highlights the importance of staying informed, thinking critically, and engaging with different perspectives.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, from the ruins of post-war Europe to the rise and fall of the Iron Curtain. If our listener could only take away one key insight from this deep dive, what would it be?
I think the most crucial takeaway is that history is never inevitable. It's the product of choices, actions, and often unintended consequences.
Right.
The fear of communism in Italy and France wasn't just about those two countries. It became a focal point for larger global anxieties,
Right.
mistrust, and this struggle for power that defined much of the 20th century.
It's a stark reminder that the world we live in today is the result of countless decisions made by those who came before us.
Absolutely.
And the decisions we're making right now will shape the world for generations to come.
Precisely. And that's why understanding history is so important. It gives us context, perspective, and hopefully the wisdom to make more informed choices.
Well said. On that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into post-war Europe. But the conversation doesn't have to end here. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive into history's most fascinating moments.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.